The clock read 5:52 a.m. when the 911 operator in Boulder, Colorado answered what would become one of the most analyzed phone calls in American criminal history. On the other end, a woman's voice trembled with panic. "Help. Police. My daughter is missing. There's a ransom note." Patsy Ramsey could barely form coherent sentences. Her 6-year-old daughter, JonBenét, was gone. A note demanding money sat on the staircase. "Please hurry." December 26, 1996. The day after Christmas. In the affluent Boulder neighborhood where the Ramseys lived, most families were still sleeping off holiday celebrations. But inside the Tudor mansion at 755 15th Street, terror had replaced joy. That 911 recording would be analyzed thousands of times over the coming decades, but in that moment, as patrol cars raced through quiet streets, no one predicted this case would become a 28-year labyrinth of unanswered questions. Officer Rick French arrived at 5:59 a.m. He stepped into what should have been treated as an active crime scene. John and Patsy Ramsey met him, frantic. Their daughter was missing. The ransom note demanded exactly $118,000 from someone calling themselves a small foreign faction. The amount was strangely specific. The language theatrical. But French's concern was finding the child. He searched the massive house, checking closets and rooms. When he reached the basement, he came to a white wooden door with a latch on the outside. He tested it, saw it appeared secured from the exterior. His reasoning seemed logical. If latched from outside, no one could be inside. He moved on without opening it. That split-second decision would become one of the most catastrophic errors in modern criminal investigation. Behind that door, in a windowless room called the wine cellar, JonBenét Ramsey lay on a white blanket. She had never left home. There was no kidnapping. The ransom note was a lie. Before we continue, where are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments. And if you're finding this investigation valuable, hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us bring you these thoroughly researched cases. Hours passed with friends arriving, contaminating what should have been a secured crime scene. Detective Linda Arndt arrived at 8 a.m., alone, requesting backup that never came. She waited for the ransom call promised between 8 and 10 a.m. It never came. At 1 p.m., Detective Arndt asked John Ramsey and Fleet White to search the house again. John walked directly to the wine cellar and opened the door. His scream echoed through the house. He grabbed JonBenét, pulled duct tape from her mouth, and carried her upstairs. Her body was pale, stiff with rigor mortis. A cord was embedded in her neck. The kidnapping that never was had become murder. And the crime scene was destroyed. Christmas Day 1996 seemed unremarkable for the Ramsey family. They spent the afternoon at home, then attended a dinner party at the home of Fleet and Priscilla White, close friends who lived nearby in Boulder. JonBenét wore a Christmas outfit and played with other children at the gathering. She ate dinner, laughed, and showed no signs of distress or illness. By all accounts, she was a happy 6-year-old enjoying the holiday season. The party wrapped up around 9 p.m., and the Ramseys said their goodbyes. The drive home was short, just a few minutes through the quiet Boulder streets. JonBenét had fallen asleep in the car, exhausted from the excitement of Christmas Day and the evening festivities. John Ramsey carried his sleeping daughter from the car into the house and up to her bedroom. According to the parents' later statements, he laid her in bed still wearing the clothes she had on, though Patsy had laid out different pajamas earlier. Burke, their 9-year-old son, went to his room. John and Patsy prepared for bed themselves. They planned to wake early the next morning for a trip to their vacation home in Michigan, then onward to a Disney cruise they had planned for the day after Christmas. This is where the known timeline ends and the mystery begins. What happened inside that house between approximately 9:30 p.m. on December 25 and 5:30 a.m. on December 26 remains one of the most debated sequences of events in true crime history. No one reported hearing screams. No one reported hearing struggles or crashes or any unusual sounds whatsoever. Yet during those hours, JonBenét Ramsey was struck with enough force to fracture her skull, then strangled with a garrote fashioned from materials found inside the home. When Patsy Ramsey descended the spiral staircase around 5:30 a.m. to begin her morning routine, she discovered several sheets of white paper laid across one of the steps. She picked them up and began reading. The words on those pages would launch an investigation that continues today. The note, written on paper from a notepad kept near the kitchen phone, was addressed to John Ramsey. It claimed to be from a group of individuals representing a small foreign faction. It stated they had JonBenét in their possession and demanded $118,000 for her safe return, money to be delivered in a brown paper bag in specific denominations. Patsy's screams brought John running. They checked JonBenét's bedroom and found it empty, her bed appearing as though she had been sleeping there but was now gone. They checked Burke's room where he remained asleep, seemingly unaware of any commotion. Despite the ransom note's explicit warning not to contact police or JonBenét would be beheaded, Patsy called 911 at 5:52 a.m. What's the weather like where you are today? Let us know in the comments. These small interactions mean everything to our channel's growth. Officer French arrived within minutes and began what should have been a systematic search and securing of the crime scene. Instead, the next several hours became a masterclass in what not to do at a potential crime scene. Friends arrived after Patsy called them for emotional support. The house filled with people. Reverend Roll Hoverstock from St. John's Episcopal Church came to pray with the family. John Ramsey called his pilot to arrange their flight to Atlanta. People moved through rooms, sat on furniture, prepared food, used bathrooms, touched doorknobs and surfaces. Every person who entered contaminated potential evidence. Every footprint, every fiber, every fingerprint from that morning made it harder to determine what evidence was related to the crime and what was simply the result of a house full of grieving people. On December 27, 1996, Dr. John Meyer, the Boulder County coroner, conducted the autopsy that would reveal the horrific final moments of JonBenét Ramsey's life. What he documented painted a picture of violence that seemed incomprehensible for a crime committed inside a family home on Christmas night. The official cause of death was asphyxiation due to strangulation associated with cranial trauma. But those clinical words barely captured the brutality of what had been done to this child. JonBenét had sustained 2 catastrophic injuries, either of which could have proven fatal. The first was a massive blow to her head. The right side of her skull showed an 8.5-inch linear fracture with an associated rectangular area of hemorrhagic contusion on the right side of her brain. This was not a minor injury from a simple fall or accidental bump. Forensic experts later estimated that the force required to cause this type of skull fracture in a child would be equivalent to falling from a 2-story building onto concrete or being struck with a heavy object swung with extreme force. The blow had caused significant bleeding between her brain and skull, a subdural hematoma that would have rendered her unconscious almost immediately. However, the autopsy findings indicated something that would become critically important to understanding what happened that night. JonBenét did not die instantly from the head wound. Her brain showed swelling that takes time to develop, suggesting she survived for a period after the initial blow, though almost certainly unconscious throughout. Medical experts who later reviewed the case estimated this survival period at somewhere between 45 minutes and 2 hours. This timing had profound implications. It meant that whoever killed JonBenét had time between the head injury and her death. Time to think. Time to make decisions. Time to act. The second catastrophic injury was strangulation by garrote. A white nylon cord, similar to that used in macrame crafts, had been tied around JonBenét's neck. Attached to this cord was a wooden stick that had been broken from one of Patsy Ramsey's paintbrush handles found in her art supply area in the basement. The stick had been used to twist the cord, progressively tightening it around JonBenét's neck in a device designed specifically to strangle. The cord had cut deeply into the skin of her neck, creating a furrow approximately 1/4 to 1/2 inch wide. There was petechial hemorrhaging in her eyes, small red spots caused by broken capillaries that are a classic indicator of strangulation. Her face showed congestion and her tongue protruded slightly, both consistent with asphyxiation. The construction of this garrote was particularly disturbing to investigators. This was not a spontaneous act. Someone had taken the time to locate a paintbrush, break it into pieces, fashion the cord into a garrote configuration with the wooden handle used as a twisting mechanism, and then methodically apply it to JonBenét's neck. This required thought, planning, and deliberate action. It suggested a level of calculation that seemed incompatible with a crime of passion or an accident that spiraled out of control. Other findings in the autopsy added layers of complexity and controversy to an already confusing case. There was evidence of what some experts interpreted as prior vaginal trauma that appeared chronic rather than acute, though no semen was found and there was no definitive evidence of sexual assault on the night of her death. JonBenét's stomach contents revealed she had eaten pineapple a few hours before death, a detail that would become significant because a bowl of pineapple with a spoon was found on the kitchen table with Burke's fingerprints on the bowl and Patsy's on the dish itself. Both parents stated they did not feed JonBenét pineapple that night and had no explanation for how she consumed it. There were abrasions on her back and right side of her face, a triangular bruise on her shoulder, and 2 small circular marks on her lower back that some experts believed could be from a stun gun, though others disputed this interpretation entirely. Her hands were loosely bound above her head with white cord, so loose that they could have easily slipped free, raising questions about whether the binding was functional or merely staging. A single piece of black duct tape covered her mouth. When John Ramsey removed it in his panic upon finding her, potential evidence was lost forever. The ransom note found on the Ramsey staircase became one of the most scrutinized documents in criminal history. Every word, every letter, every pen stroke has been analyzed by handwriting experts, linguists, forensic document examiners, and countless amateur investigators trying to unlock its secrets. The note was extraordinary in almost every aspect, beginning with its length. Most ransom notes in genuine kidnapping cases are brief, perhaps a few sentences communicating demands and threats. Kidnappers want to minimize the time spent writing, minimize the handwriting sample they provide to investigators, and distance themselves from the crime as quickly as possible. The JonBenét ransom note was 2.5 pages long, containing approximately 370 words across multiple paragraphs. The note was written on white-lined paper torn from a notepad that belonged to the Ramsey family, kept near the kitchen telephone. Investigators found the notepad with several pages missing, the torn edges matching the ransom note pages. Even more revealing, they found what appeared to be a practice start to the note on an earlier page in the pad. Someone had written Mr. and Mrs. R. before stopping, crossing it out, and apparently starting over. The final version began Mr. Ramsey rather than addressing both parents. This practice attempt suggested the note writer had been inside the Ramsey home for an extended period, comfortable enough to draft and redraft their message. The note was written with a black Sharpie marker, also from inside the Ramsey home. The content itself struck investigators and analysts as bizarre, almost theatrical. It used language that seemed drawn from movies rather than reality. Phrases like, and hence, and references to an attaché case for carrying ransom money seemed oddly formal and dated. The note referenced Southern common sense, which seemed like a strangely specific detail. It contained dramatic lines like, the 2 gentlemen watching over your daughter do not particularly like you, so I advise you not to provoke them. The author referred to themselves inconsistently, sometimes using we to suggest a group, other times using I as an individual, creating ambiguity about whether one person or multiple people had written it. Some analysts noted phrases that appeared to reference popular movies. Don't try to grow a brain echoed language from the film Speed. Use that good Southern common sense of yours was similar to dialogue from Ransom, which had been released in theaters just weeks before JonBenét's death. The closing signature, Victory. SBTC, has never been definitively explained, though theories have ranged from military terminology to religious references to complete fabrication meant to mislead. What time is it where you're watching this? Day or night, this case continues to haunt those seeking answers. Drop the time in the comments below. The ransom amount itself was perhaps the most compelling evidence that the note writer had insider knowledge of the Ramsey family. The demand for exactly $118,000 in specific denominations matched John Ramsey's recent Christmas bonus from Access Graphics almost to the dollar. This was not public information. It was specific financial detail that would primarily be known to the Ramsey family and perhaps a small number of people within the company who handled payroll and executive compensation. An intruder would need some connection to the family or the business to know this figure. Handwriting analysis became a major focus of the investigation. The Boulder Police Department brought in multiple experts to compare the ransom note to writing samples from John Ramsey, Patsy Ramsey, and others connected to the case. John Ramsey was excluded by most experts as the note's author, his handwriting showing significant differences from the ransom note. Patsy Ramsey, however, could not be excluded. Several experts said her handwriting shared notable similarities with the note, though no expert would definitively state she wrote it. The Ramseys did not provide handwriting samples immediately, waiting several days before complying with police requests, and when Patsy finally provided exemplars, investigators noted her handwriting appeared to vary from sample to sample, as if she were attempting to disguise her natural style. The Boulder Police Department's investigation quickly centered on the family itself, focusing primarily on Patsy and John Ramsey as the most likely suspects in their daughter's death. The theory that someone inside the home was responsible gained traction among investigators for multiple compelling reasons that seemed to point toward staging rather than a genuine intruder kidnapping and murder. The evidence, when viewed through this lens, painted a disturbing picture of a cover-up that may have begun in the hours after a tragic accident or a moment of uncontrolled rage. The first and most obvious problem was the complete absence of any clear evidence of forced entry into the home. Investigators examined every door, every window, every possible access point. There were no broken locks, no jimmied door frames, no shattered windows except for one in the basement that John Ramsey explained he had broken himself months earlier when locked out. That basement window became a focal point, with some theorizing an intruder could have entered there, but the evidence was problematic. There was an undisturbed spiderweb in the window well, debris and glass on the floor inside that showed no disturbance, and a Samsonite suitcase positioned beneath the window that some claimed was used as a step but could just as easily have been coincidentally placed. The ransom note itself became the strongest argument for family involvement. The fact that it was written on materials from inside the home, that it referenced John's specific bonus amount, that it was unusually long suggesting the writer had time and felt comfortable in the house, and that Patsy could not be excluded as its author all pointed toward someone with intimate knowledge and access. The practice version found in the notepad reinforced this. An intruder planning a kidnapping would likely prepare their ransom note beforehand, not sit in the victim's home drafting and redrafting it while the family slept upstairs. Detective Steve Thomas, one of the lead investigators on the case, developed a specific theory that he detailed in a book published after his resignation from the Boulder Police Department. Thomas believed Patsy Ramsey had killed her daughter in a moment of rage triggered by a bedwetting incident. JonBenét had a history of bedwetting, and the stress of the holidays, the late night, and the pressure of maintaining their perfect family image could have created a breaking point. In this theory, Patsy struck JonBenét, causing the catastrophic head injury, then realized what she had done. Rather than call for help, rather than admit what happened, she made a calculated decision to stage an elaborate kidnapping scene. She wrote the ransom note while her daughter lay dying or dead in the basement. She applied the garrote either to complete the killing or to further the staging. She called 911 and played the role of terrified mother. The fiber evidence seemed to support family involvement. Forensic analysis found fibers consistent with Patsy's jacket on the duct tape that covered JonBenét's mouth and entwined in the cord used to construct the garrote. The defense explanation was innocent transfer, that Patsy had tucked JonBenét into bed that night and fibers naturally transferred during normal contact. Prosecutors argued the specific location of these fibers, particularly in the garrote cord, suggested Patsy's direct involvement in constructing the device used to strangle her daughter. Similar fiber evidence pointed to John, with fibers consistent with his shirt found in JonBenét's underwear, though again this could be explained by innocent contact during bedtime routines or through mixed laundry. The behavioral observations of the Ramseys in the hours and days after JonBenét's body was found raised suspicions among investigators. John made arrangements to fly to Atlanta within hours of finding his daughter's body. Patsy was observed peeking through her fingers while her hands covered her face, as if watching people's reactions rather than being lost in grief. These observations were subjective and perhaps unfair, as there is no standard way people should grieve, but they contributed to investigators' growing belief that something was wrong with the family's presentation. The decision to hire prominent criminal defense attorneys immediately, before John and Patsy were even considered suspects, struck investigators as unusual. Most innocent parents of murdered children cooperate fully with police, desperate to help find the killer. The Ramseys, on advice of counsel, did not sit for formal police interviews for 4 months after JonBenét's death. This was their legal right, but it severely hampered the investigation during the critical early period when memories are freshest and when innocent parties typically want to provide every detail that might help solve the case. In September 1998, a grand jury was convened to hear evidence. Grand jury proceedings are secret, so the public did not know what testimony was presented or what witnesses said. The grand jury met for over a year, hearing from dozens of witnesses and reviewing thousands of pages of evidence. In October 1999, District Attorney Alex Hunter announced that no charges would be filed, stating the evidence was insufficient. What the public did not learn until 2013 was that the grand jury had actually voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey, not for murder, but for child abuse resulting in death and for accessory to a crime. The language suggested the grand jury believed the parents had placed JonBenet in a dangerous situation that led to her death and had helped someone avoid prosecution. However, Alex Hunter refused to sign the indictment. Under Colorado law, a district attorney is not required to prosecute based solely on a grand jury vote. Hunter determined that the evidence, while suspicious, was not sufficient to prove the charges beyond reasonable doubt at trial. He believed attempting prosecution would result in acquittal and would forever close the door on finding the real killer if the Ramseys were indeed innocent. This decision, when it became public years later, sparked intense controversy about whether justice had been served or denied. A third theory emerged that focused on Burke Ramsey, the 9-year-old brother who was asleep in his room when police arrived that morning. This theory suggested that Burke had struck JonBenet during a late-night confrontation, perhaps over the bowl of pineapple found on the kitchen table, and that John and Patsy had discovered what happened and staged an elaborate cover-up to protect their surviving child. The theory gained traction among some investigators and became the subject of intense media speculation, particularly after Burke remained largely silent about the case for nearly 2 decades. The physical evidence that pointed toward Burke was limited but intriguing. His fingerprints were found on the bowl of pineapple discovered on the kitchen table, the same pineapple that autopsy results showed JonBenet had consumed hours before her death. The parents stated they did not feed her pineapple and had no explanation for how she ate it. The theory proposed that both children had been awake late that night, that they encountered each other in the kitchen, and that some confrontation occurred. Perhaps Burke refused to share. Perhaps JonBenet grabbed a piece from his bowl. Perhaps an argument escalated into violence. Proponents of this theory argued it explained why parents would engage in such extreme cover-up behavior. If Burke had struck his sister, even accidentally, causing the catastrophic head injury, John and Patsy faced an impossible situation. Their daughter was dying or dead. Their son, at age 9, could not be prosecuted for murder under Colorado law due to his age. Calling police and admitting what happened would destroy their family publicly while resulting in no criminal justice outcome. In this scenario, the parents made a horrific calculation to stage a kidnapping, write the ransom note, and construct the garrote to protect Burke from a lifetime of being known as the boy who killed his sister. However, this theory faced significant challenges from forensic experts. The skull fracture JonBenet sustained required tremendous force, far more than would typically be expected from a 9-year-old child striking his sister. Experts estimated the blow would be equivalent to falling from a two-story building or being struck with a heavy object swung with adult force. While it's not impossible for a child to generate such force, particularly if using a weapon like a flashlight or baseball bat, it seemed unlikely. Additionally, the theory required believing that parents would then strangle their unconscious daughter with a garrote to complete the staging, an act that seemed psychologically implausible even in the most extreme circumstances. Burke Ramsey lived largely out of public view for decades after his sister's murder. He changed schools, avoided media attention, and rarely spoke about the case. His silence fueled speculation and allowed theories about his involvement to grow unchecked. In 2016, Burke finally agreed to his first major television interview with Dr. Phil McGraw. He spoke about his memories of that night and the morning after, describing being woken by commotion in the house and later learning his sister was dead. He discussed the pain of losing JonBenét and the additional trauma of being suspected by some people of involvement in her death. He maintained he had nothing to do with what happened and expressed frustration that conspiracy theories had followed him throughout his life. That same year, CBS aired a documentary series titled The Case of JonBenét Ramsey, that explicitly presented the theory that Burke had struck his sister and that the parents had covered it up. The documentary featured investigators and experts who laid out this scenario in detail, suggesting it was the most logical explanation for all the evidence. Burke Ramsey responded by filing a massive defamation lawsuit against CBS, the production company, and several individuals involved in creating the documentary. He argued that the documentary had destroyed his reputation by accusing him of murder without sufficient evidence and in a manner designed for maximum sensational impact. The lawsuit sought hundreds of millions of dollars in damages. In 2019, the case was settled for an undisclosed amount, with terms that remain confidential. The settlement did not include any admission of wrongdoing by CBS, but it effectively ended the public airing of this particular theory in mainstream media. The theory that would eventually lead to official exoneration of the Ramsey family centered on DNA evidence discovered on JonBenét's clothing, evidence that pointed toward an unknown male who had never been identified despite decades of investigation and database searches. This DNA became both the most promising lead in solving the case and the most controversial piece of evidence, with experts bitterly divided over its significance and meaning. The DNA story began during the initial evidence collection in December 1996, when forensic scientists carefully documented and preserved samples from JonBenét's body and the clothing she wore when found in the wine cellar. In 1997, initial DNA testing identified the presence of DNA from an unknown male in the crotch area of JonBenét's underwear. The sample was a mixture consisting primarily of JonBenét's own DNA, but also including genetic material from a male who was not John Ramsey, not Burke Ramsey, and not anyone else in the immediate family. The profile did not match any of the early suspects in the case. When run through criminal databases, it produced no hits. This unknown male DNA raised immediate questions about its origin and significance. Was this DNA from JonBenét's killer, left behind during the commission of the crime? Or was it innocent transfer DNA that had nothing to do with her murder? The challenge with interpreting this evidence lay in understanding how the DNA might have been deposited. The underwear JonBenét was wearing when found was brand new, several sizes too large for her small frame. Patsy Ramsey explained that she had purchased a package of underwear as a gift for a niece, but JonBenét had wanted some pairs for herself. Patsy had opened the package and allowed JonBenét to take several pairs. The child had apparently selected an oversized pair to wear that night. Because the underwear was new and had come directly from commercial packaging, there was legitimate concern that the DNA could have been deposited during the manufacturing process, at the factory where the underwear was made, during quality control inspection, during packaging, or even at the retail store where it was purchased. Touch DNA transfers easily. A factory worker who handled the fabric, a quality inspector who examined the garment, a stock clerk who shelved the package, any of these individuals could have innocently left trace amounts of DNA that had nothing to do with JonBenét's murder. For years, this DNA evidence was noted but not considered definitive proof of an intruder. Investigators who believed in family involvement argued that the DNA was likely innocent transfer and did not exonerate anyone. However, in 2003, more sophisticated DNA testing was conducted using newer technology that had not been available in 1997. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation developed a more complete genetic profile of the unknown male DNA. This enhanced profile was entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which contains millions of DNA profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees, and forensic samples from crime scenes across the country. The search found no match. The unknown male whose DNA was on JonBenét's underwear was not in any law enforcement database. The breakthrough that would change the trajectory of the investigation came in 2008, when investigators decided to test JonBenét's long johns, the pants she wore over her underwear. Using advanced touch DNA technology, which can extract usable DNA profiles from skin cells left on objects through casual contact, forensic scientists found DNA on the waistband area and on the legs of the long johns. When this DNA profile was analyzed and compared to the unknown male DNA from the underwear, it was consistent. The same unknown male DNA appeared in two separate locations on two different articles of clothing. This finding was significant because it addressed the manufacturing contamination concern. The long johns were not new. They were JonBenét's own clothing that she had worn before, that had been washed in the Ramsey household laundry. The probability that the same unknown male DNA would appear on both the underwear and the long johns through completely innocent and unrelated transfer seemed much lower than the probability that this DNA was deposited by someone who had contact with JonBenét during or around the time of her death. The presence of matching DNA in multiple locations suggested actual contact rather than random manufacturing contamination. In May 2008, Boulder District Attorney Mary Lacey took the unprecedented step of sending a formal letter to John Ramsey officially exonerating the entire Ramsey family. Lacey wrote that the DNA evidence, particularly the presence of the same unknown male profile in multiple locations and in circumstances that suggested it was deposited at the time of the crime, indicated that an intruder had committed the murder. She stated that the Ramsey family members were innocent victims and apologized for the years of public suspicion and accusation they had endured. She expressed hope that the DNA would eventually lead investigators to the real killer. If you're still with us on this investigation, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps more people discover the truth about cases like this. What's your theory so far? Comment below. This exoneration was immediately controversial within law enforcement circles. Many investigators who had worked the case for years were stunned by the decision. They argued that District Attorney Lacey had overstepped her authority, that DNA evidence alone was insufficient to completely exclude the Ramseys, and that touch DNA could still have multiple innocent explanations that did not involve the killer. The Boulder Police Department did not fully embrace the exoneration, maintaining that the investigation remained open and that all theories were still under consideration. The JonBenét Ramsey case became a textbook example of how not to conduct a homicide investigation, with failures at virtually every level from the first moments police arrived through years of missteps that followed. Understanding why this case remains unsolved after 28 years requires examining the cascade of errors that compromised justice from the beginning. These failures were not malice or corruption, but rather a perfect storm of inexperience, poor decisions, and circumstances that made finding truth nearly impossible. The most catastrophic failure occurred in the first hour. When Officer Rick French arrived at 5:59 a.m., he assessed this as a kidnapping based on the ransom note. He conducted a cursory basement search, but when he reached the wine cellar door latched from outside, he decided not to open it. His reasoning seemed logical: if latched from outside, no one could be inside. But JonBenét's body was behind that door. Had French opened it, the crime scene would have been secured immediately. Position of the body, condition of evidence, integrity of the scene would have been preserved. Instead, the body remained undiscovered for 7 more hours while people contaminated the house. The decision to allow friends and family to gather at the home compounded the disaster. Within an hour, the house filled with people providing emotional support. Friends, the church reverend, multiple visitors walked through rooms, touched surfaces, prepared food. Every person potentially brought new fibers, hair, trace evidence. Every surface touched, every item moved, every step taken contaminated what should have been pristine. Proper protocol would have immediately secured the house, allowing only essential law enforcement inside. Instead, evidence was destroyed with every passing minute. Detective Linda Arndt's situation highlighted another critical failure. She arrived around 8 a.m. and found herself alone, the only detective on scene for an alleged child kidnapping. She requested backup repeatedly, asking for additional detectives, FBI agents, crime scene technicians. Her requests were not fulfilled timely. She spent hours essentially babysitting the scene without resources to properly manage an investigation of this magnitude. Why Boulder police failed to deploy adequate personnel remains unanswered. The decision at 1 p.m. to have John Ramsey and Fleet White search the house violated basic protocol. A proper search should have been conducted by trained investigators who would recognize evidence, document location and condition, maintain chain of custody. Allowing the victim's father to search meant when John found JonBenét, his instinct was to pick her up, destroying critical information about her position and how the killer left her. Removing duct tape from her mouth contaminated potential DNA. Carrying her upstairs meant trace evidence fell off, fibers transferred, and the original crime scene was irreparably altered. Boulder Police Department's inexperience created ongoing problems. Boulder was a college town with low violent crime. Homicides were rare. Child murders virtually unprecedented. Detectives made mistakes in evidence collection, interview techniques, investigative strategy. They became convinced early of family involvement and pursued that theory almost exclusively, potentially missing evidence pointing elsewhere. Their relationship with the district attorney deteriorated into public conflict, with police believing prosecutors were too soft and prosecutors believing police had tunnel vision. The Ramsey family's decision to hire prominent defense attorneys immediately and decline formal interviews for 4 months was their legal right, but created adversarial dynamics. In most child murders, parents cooperate fully, desperate to help find the killer. The Ramseys' approach appeared suspicious. Crucial interviews during the period when memories were freshest did not occur. When they finally agreed to interviews in April 1997, 4 months had passed. They had been extensively coached by attorneys. The spontaneity and detail from immediate interviews was lost forever. Media attention created its own problems. The case became national obsession within days. Information leaked constantly. This media circus meant potential witnesses and suspects knew what evidence existed, what theories investigators pursued. It became nearly impossible to conduct confidential investigative work. Every police move was analyzed and criticized publicly. Pressure to produce results became intense, leading to mistakes and premature conclusions. The 2008 DNA exoneration of the Ramsey family by District Attorney Mary Lacey stunned veteran investigators who had spent years building the case for family involvement. The decision sparked fierce debate within law enforcement circles and the forensic science community about what DNA evidence can and cannot prove, about the proper interpretation of touch DNA, and about whether a prosecutor had overstepped in declaring a family innocent based on evidence that remained deeply ambiguous. Critics argued that Lacey had made a premature judgment that could potentially shield the real killer if that person turned out to be a family member after all. The central question in the DNA controversy was simple but profound. Does the presence of unknown male DNA on JonBenét's clothing definitively prove an intruder killed her, or could that DNA have innocent explanations unrelated to the crime? Touch DNA technology, which was relatively new when used in the JonBenét case, can extract usable genetic profiles from tiny amounts of biological material left behind through casual contact. This technology has solved countless cold cases by identifying suspects from DNA on objects they touched. However, it has also introduced complexity into evidence interpretation because touch DNA transfers so easily and can persist on objects for extended periods. The critics of the exoneration pointed out that touch DNA can be deposited in numerous innocent ways that have nothing to do with criminal activity. A person can leave DNA on an object without ever being present at a crime scene. If someone at a clothing factory touched the fabric while manufacturing JonBenét's underwear, their DNA could be present. If someone at the distribution warehouse handled the package, their DNA could transfer. If a retail employee at the store where Patsy purchased the underwear touched the package or the individual pairs while stocking shelves, their DNA could be there. The same logic applied to the long johns. While they were not new like the underwear, they had been washed in the Ramsey household laundry, potentially mixed with other family members' clothing or even clothing from other households if the Ramseys ever did laundry at a laundromat or had help with laundry. Furthermore, critics noted that the amount of DNA found was minimal, trace amounts consistent with touch DNA rather than the more substantial DNA deposits that would be expected from violent physical contact during a murder. In a crime involving manual strangulation with a garrote, significant physical contact between perpetrator and victim would be expected. The killer's hands constructed the garrote, tied it around JonBenét's neck, twisted the wooden handle to tighten the cord. This level of contact should have left substantial amounts of DNA on the cord itself, on JonBenét's neck, potentially under her fingernails if there had been any struggle. Yet the DNA found was minimal and not in locations that clearly indicated involvement in the crime itself. Some forensic experts argued that the presence of DNA in two locations, the underwear and the long johns, did strengthen the significance of the evidence because it reduced the probability of innocent transfer. However, others countered that if the DNA was deposited innocently on one item, say the underwear during manufacturing, it could have transferred to the long johns through contact between the two garments when JonBenét put them on or through the physical positioning of her body after death when the clothing items were in contact. DNA can transfer from surface to surface, a phenomenon called secondary transfer, which makes interpretation even more complicated. The Boulder Police Department never fully accepted the exoneration. While they acknowledged the importance of DNA evidence, they maintained that the investigation remained active and that all theories, including family involvement, were still under consideration. Many detectives who had worked the case felt that decades of investigative work, the fiber evidence connecting Patsy to the crime scene, the handwriting analysis that could not exclude her as the ransom note author, the grand jury indictment, all of this was being dismissed based on DNA evidence that had alternative explanations. They believed the exoneration was premature and potentially harmful to the ongoing investigation. Supporters of the exoneration, including John Ramsey himself, argued that the DNA evidence was the most objective and scientific evidence in the entire case. Unlike behavioral observations that are subjective, unlike handwriting analysis that is interpretive, DNA is concrete biological evidence. The fact that the same unknown male profile appeared in multiple locations suggested strongly that this person had contact with JonBenét around the time of her death. The absence of any match in Cody's despite the profile being in the system for years suggested this was not a known criminal, but that did not mean it was not the killer. Many murderers have no prior criminal record. The DNA represented the best hope for solving the case if genealogical technology could identify the unknown male. Patsy Ramsey died on June 24, 2006, at age 49 from ovarian cancer. She passed away 2 years before the DNA exoneration that would officially clear her family's name. Throughout her illness and until her final days, Patsy maintained her innocence, giving interviews expressing frustration with the investigation, pain at being suspected, and desperate desire to know who killed her daughter. She said she prayed daily that the killer would be found and brought to justice. She never received that answer. John Ramsey, now in his 80s, has continued speaking publicly about the case in the years since Patsy's death. He has appeared on television programs, given interviews to journalists, and participated in numerous documentaries. He consistently maintains that neither he nor his wife harmed JonBenét and that an intruder killed her. In recent years, John Ramsey has become a vocal advocate for advanced forensic genealogy, the revolutionary technology that identified the Golden State Killer in 2018 after decades of that case remaining unsolved. Forensic genealogy works by uploading crime scene DNA profiles to public genealogical databases where millions of people have submitted their DNA for ancestry research. Investigators look for partial matches with relatives of the unknown suspect, then build family trees working backward and forward through generations to identify possible suspects. The technique has solved dozens of cold cases from the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s that seemed impossible to crack through traditional investigation methods. The unknown male DNA profile from JonBenét's underwear and long johns remains preserved and intact, suitable for genealogical analysis. John Ramsey has given numerous interviews calling on Boulder Police Department to send evidence to private labs specializing in genealogical DNA work. He believes this represents the best and perhaps only remaining hope for finally identifying his daughter's killer. If the DNA truly came from the perpetrator, and if that person has relatives who have submitted DNA to genealogical databases, the case could potentially be solved using the same methodology that identified the Golden State Killer and numerous other cold case suspects. In 2021, Boulder Police announced they were working with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and other partners to review the case using latest forensic technology. They stated commitment to using every available tool to solve the case, including advanced DNA analysis. In 2022, the department reiterated this commitment with limited updates, indicating active work on DNA testing and analysis though declining specific details about what evidence was being tested or what methods were being used. In late 2024, reports emerged of renewed investigation activity. Sources indicated additional DNA testing was being conducted and investigators were pursuing new leads. Boulder Police Chief made a public statement reaffirming the department's commitment to solving the case. The critical question is whether genealogical DNA can solve this case. The answer depends entirely on whether the unknown male DNA found on JonBenét's clothing actually came from her killer. If the DNA is from the killer and if that person has relatives in genealogical databases, then yes, the case could be solved. Investigators would identify the family tree, narrow down potential suspects, and use traditional investigation to determine which family member was in Boulder on Christmas night 1996. However, if the DNA was deposited through innocent transfer before the crime, genealogical analysis will only identify an innocent person, a dead end consuming investigative resources. What would justice look like after 28 years? If solved tomorrow, if a suspect were identified and prosecuted, would that provide closure? For John Ramsey, justice means knowing the truth about who killed his daughter and clearing his family's name once and for all. For investigators who worked this case for decades, justice means finally answering the question that haunted them. For the public that followed this case with fascination and frustration, justice means closure to one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in American crime history. One last thing before we close this investigation. If this deep dive resonated with you, if you believe cases like this deserve continued attention until justice is served, subscribe to our channel. Share this video with someone who remembers this case or someone interested in true crime investigation. And tell us in the comments, what do you think happened to JonBenét Ramsey? Do you believe the DNA evidence will finally solve this case after all these years? Your engagement keeps these investigations alive. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was born August 6, 1990, in Atlanta, Georgia. She was a bright, energetic 6-year-old who loved performing, took dance and singing lessons, and participated in child beauty pageants where she won multiple titles. She was in first grade, doing well academically and socially. She deserved to grow up, to go to middle school and high school, to choose a career, to live whatever life she wanted. Instead, her life was cut short at age 6 on Christmas night in her own home. 28 years have passed. 28 years of investigation, speculation, and searching for answers. 28 years of advances in forensic technology. 28 years of her family living under suspicion. 28 years without justice. But the case remains open. The investigation continues. And somewhere in the DNA evidence or in information not yet uncovered, the truth may be waiting. Someone knows what happened to JonBenét Ramsey on Christmas night 1996. That person could still come forward. Tips can be submitted to Boulder Police Department at any time. Even after 28 years, even a small piece of information could finally solve this case. JonBenét Ramsey deserves justice. Her family deserves answers. And the truth deserves to be told.